Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started.
Why don't you go ahead and summarize what happened in that last episode for us, Venus?
Well, we begin with the experimentation of X-rays, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
Röntgen, and then that eventually becomes the beginning to when they want to research nuclear power, right?
I mean, that sparked like a lot more
One of the
people's interest in radiation.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so radiation and waves and all of that. I mean, there was a lot in both of these episodes going on that I just decided to filter out. There's so much
Right.
that I had to filter out of these episodes to make them just a two-parter. But yeah, that's what sparked like a greater interest in radiation. And after they were like, "Oh, we can get energy out of this," they were like, "You know what else we can make
We
with
could
this?"
do weapons.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so wasn't it Germany who started the kind of looking into it first?
I mean, everyone was kind of looking into it. The US was looking into it at the same time that France was. Nazi Germany was also looking into it. And it was a Jewish German woman who first discovered the ability to create fission.
Mm-hmm.
But because of all the moving around, because of the occupation of the Nazis, it was kind of split between US and Germany. So you're right there, but the Allies versus the Axis.
And wasn't that part of like they couldn't get the supplies they needed?
Mhm.
The heavy water. Is that
Yes.
what it was? Yeah, they couldn't
Yes.
get the supplies they needed to become fully successful in their
Mhm.
ventures.
Mhm.
So the first bomb test, where was that at?
That
That was in the
was
Los Alamos?
It
No.
wasn't actually in Los Alamos. It was about 200 miles away from the Los
Okay.
Alamos facility, but it was
Okay.
in New Mexico and it was called Trinity.
Mm.
After the Holy Trinity, actually, which I didn't
Oh,
mention.
really?
Yes, because Oppenheimer was, I don't know, I guess he was a smart guy. He read a lot. And so he named it after like some poem about the Holy Trinity.
That was given out, like they gave out jobs to the Navajo people, if I remember correctly. It was a
Yeah.
big project and a lot of
Yeah.
people, like it was like one of the biggest undertakings,
It was a huge undertaking.
like
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
US had done at this time.
Hmm.
And then we fast forward to the inevitable.
Yes, unfortunately. It was inevitable because we had the bomb and of course we were going to drop it. And we
Yep.
did.
And we did, sadly. And so if you want to hear some more graphic descriptions and delve into that bit more, check out part 1.
Yes, and please do check out part 1 to give some context to what we're talking about today.
Yes.
But
Because that's about an hour and a half, 2-hour episode condensed into 2 minutes. So
right, yeah, we talk about a lot. We talk
they're
about a
very
lot.
TLDR.
And I still filtered out a lot.
Yeah.
But so yeah, we ended after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then I talked briefly about the reorganization of the Manhattan Project following World War II because the episode is Manhattan Project Part 1, and I didn't feel like making another 3-hour long episode like Jonestown because that was a lot for everybody, I think.
Right.
But the story does continue, and it really was like a Manhattan Project Part 2. Like, I don't want to say it was worse because in very few ways can you say anything is worse than bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it didn't get
Sure.
better by any means, you know?
No, but I'm really interested in this because I don't really know much about the Manhattan Project after
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's kind of the general population,
Well, because I don't
right?
think they really wanted you to know a whole lot about what happened after. Like, in the 50s and 60s, we were very proud of what we were doing following the Manhattan Project. But
Mm-hmm.
since about the 1990s, we've been more like, what if we just didn't talk about that? So
Right.
that is this story that we're getting
Okay.
into.
Well, tell it like it is.
A door was opened in 1945 that can never again be closed. Plutonium was first created in 1944 But the explosions at Trinity and Nagasaki released approximately 10,000 kilograms of plutonium isotopes that scattered around the globe and entered into the bodies of everyone alive that year and every single person born thereafter. The estimated 210,000 people who died as a direct result of the bomb or its radioactive effects by the end of 1945 were not the only victims. Many more would, of course, start to show signs of sickness in the years to follow in Japan, but the continued activity at Hanford, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, the Marshall Islands, and the Nevada test site by the U.S. government would sicken and kill thousands of their own citizens and displace hundreds of people in their trusteeship. Almost immediately after the war ended, the government began looking for a new place to continue to detonate nuclear weapons for testing, this time at sea. The location had to be isolated, an area under U.S. control, basically be uninhabited because of the 150-mile radius that was recommended for safety after Trinity, or they
Mhm.
were going to have to easily displace people from this radius.
Mhm.
And it had to have sheltered anchorage for Japanese target ships acquired after they forced Japan to surrender. These were going to be the target ships that the Navy wanted to do testing on.
Okay. Okay,
Mhm.
I was like, why did I get it now though? I get it.
Bikini Atoll, one of many communities living on circular coral reefs of the Marshall Islands and subsisting primarily off seafood caught in the central lagoon, had previously been under Japanese control but was taken by U.S. forces in 1944, and it fit the bill for a test site. On February 10th, 1946, a naval officer spoke with the village elected magistrate named Judah and the heads of several families through an interpreter and told them that the U.S. needed the island to further test the bombs that had won the war and asked them to leave their homes, promising that the government would find them all new homes. And he was asking them to do it in the next week.
Okay.
Yeah. They did actually get three, but still, it's like, and it's like, what choice do they have? They really have no
Right.
way to
To
argue,
say
like,
no.
yeah, because now, like, this is the, colonial authority that they're under. Before that, it was Japan. Before that, it was Germany. Before that, it was Spain. Like,
Right.
they don't have any authority. They're only a population of 167 people.
Yeah.
And they were told that it was going to be temporary. So they were like, I guess we'll
Oh, they
say
were
yes.
oh, well,
Yeah.
that makes things different too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, yeah, you temporarily need my home, you'll give me somewhere else to live. That doesn't sound like too bad of a bag.
Yeah.
Like,
It doesn't sound terrible if that's what you're asking us to do. They were like, "You'll be
if that
back
were
in a
the truth.
right, right." And I mean, these people, they don't have access to the radios that everybody else has, so they don't know really much more than there was a big, a huge bomb. It won the war. They, Japan lost. The U.S. came in. They don't know what radiation is. They don't know. They don't
Right.
know anything about probably the nuances of what are happening in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so they're like, if it's going to be temporary, sure, fine, we'll deal. We'll put up with it. And, we'll be back in a couple of months. So they were relocated 125 miles east to an uninhabited atoll called Rongerik that bikini and Navy workers had prepared to be their new home in that 3-week period. Rongerik was much smaller than Bikini. It was composed of 10 islands that put together barely made up a third of the size of Bikini's 26 islands, and the lagoon was a quarter of the size, so they weren't able to catch as many fish. Within 6 months, Bikinians were experiencing a critical food shortage and were on the verge of starvation.
Well, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Why didn't they just use this place?
I don't know. I don't know why they didn't just use this place. I
Like,
don't know.
do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I
No, I get
mean,
what you're saying.
but okay.
Yeah.
Ugh, that's tragic though.
So Operation Crossroads began on July 1st by detonating a bomb 520 feet above target ships filled with pigs, goats, mice, and guinea pigs for live test subjects. This was called Test Shot Able and was the very same bomb that Louis Slotin had died attempting to construct less than a month before. Within 7 hours, researchers were able to get to almost the hypocenter of the explosion, based on Geiger counter readings, which indicated that the radiation on the ships had lowered to a safe level. This is likely due in great part to the winds on the Pacific, which bombers found pushed their payloads off target, and which also carried away the radioactive fallout elsewhere on the planet. 2 weeks later, Senator Carl Hatch of New Mexico met with the Bikinians on Rongerik and relayed a message from President Truman thanking them for their sacrifice. He then presented their elected leader with gifts of a pipe and a carton of cigarettes, a cigarette holder, matches, and a set of photographs depicting the Able Test's mushroom cloud over Bikini Atoll.
No.
Yeah, yeah, like the
What
insensitivity,
the fuck?
I cannot fathom it. I cannot. And like when they heard the explosion, because it's a massive explosion on
Sure.
like over the ocean, they heard it. They just they cried because they were like, our home's probably destroyed. What could have survived that?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh
So
my
it's
gosh.
fucked up. It's fucked up.
And so how long, like, for me chronologically to catch back up, like, how long was this after the war? Like July 1st of when?
This was the year after. This is July 1st, 1946.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not quite a full year since the
Since the bombing.
yeah, yeah.
Gotcha.
According to Joint Task Force Commander Admiral Blandy describing the fallout damage in 1947, quote, only deserted areas received the continuous and invisible fallout of radioactive materials. Fortunately, the contaminated areas healed themselves relatively promptly. But this was not to be the case for long. 3 weeks after Able, the first underwater bomb was detonated during the Baker test shot, 90 feet below the surface of the lagoon, which itself was only 180 feet deep. This Fat Man style plutonium bomb was nicknamed Helen of Bikini and was expected to release energy the equivalent of 23,000 tons of TNT, which some were concerned would cause massive tidal waves and a radioactive column of water that would land on the ships and hold the radiation much longer than the fallout from the
Mm.
air during Test Able. And if we thought that the pictures were insensitive before, Judah, the leader, was invited to tour his former home to see, it's still intact, but then he was also permitted to watch the Baker explosion.
Oh
Yeah. I don't understand. I don't understand how people are like, "You think this is cool, right?" And it's like, "You know this is my home, right? Like, why aren't you
my
doing
god.
it on
Right.
yours?"
Right.
Yeah.
Like, why are you doing this to my home? Why don't you shit on your front
Yeah,
porch?
shit where you eat.
Yeah.
So even with an underwater detonation, the bomb released a fireball into the air and shot water a mile and a half up and 2,000 feet out from the center in the first minute. A base surge then followed, which was a poisonous ring of radioactive mist that spread outward from the column of water at 135 miles an hour. 90-foot waves hit the ships closest to the hypocenter. In the lagoon below, the bomb blew open a 2,000-foot wide, 32-foot deep crater.
Jesus.
The radioactive water that scientists feared would fall onto the ships filled with test animals did so. The contaminated water, sand, metal fragments, and coral emitted gamma radiation such that even an hour after detonation, the measured radiation levels were 3 times the estimated lethal dose to humans, a number which had been determined earlier that year by the Joint Task Force Radiological Safety Section's experiments on an 8,000-person workforce. A human workforce.
Yeah.
Even as the sun dried the water from the surfaces, the radioactive particles remained on board, embedded in the paint, metal, wood, ropes, clothing, and canvas on the ships. Researchers were prevented from boarding the ships for 5 days after detonation because of the high levels of radioactivity still being detected by Geiger counters. Cleanup efforts were made on the ships, but even so, some of the most badly contaminated ships were still so hot by August 3rd that the chief physician, Dr. Warren, who we actually talked about in the last episode, not being so worried about fallout before Trinity,
Mm-hmm.
he said that some ships needed to be considered completely lost. It had been assumed that the tidal flow would clear the radioactivity out of the lagoon, but instead, it was found that aquatic flora and fauna soaked up the radioactive material and retained it. Radiation in the lagoon was found to increase at night and decrease during the day because radioactive plankton rose and fell in the water in response to sunlight. Even months after Baker, 50% of the total radioactive material from the bomb remained in the lagoon.
Oh my god.
Large amounts of radioactivity were measured in the bottom of the lagoon, especially near the sunken test ships. The radioactive particles settled in the sediment and were taken up by worms and sea cucumbers, as well as plant life, all of which was eaten by small fish, which were eaten by bigger fish and crustaceans. And so it caused what is called biomagnification.
Mm-hmm.
Navy tests showed that of the more than 1,000 species of organisms on Bikini and in the lagoon, many of them continued to reproduce and few reproduced with mutations, which they thought was good.
Mm-hmm. That sounds
However,
nice. Oh.
however, their tests may have already been unintentionally biased in their favor because the insecticide DDT had been used near facilities the Seabees built on Bikini before the chemical was banned in the 60s. And so they probably already killed a lot of those organisms that weren't as strong. And then they were
Mm,
testing afterwards and saying, look, everything's fine.
right. No, it's just that we killed them.
Yeah, exactly. Leslie Groves himself, the Major General who oversaw the Manhattan Project and who was the top military leader at Los Alamos, opposed the idea of a third test at Bikini. Shot Charlie was intended to occur 2,000 feet below sea level, but this was not considered a real life use since most harbors or offshore areas, which would be targets, were considered shallow areas that were already emulated in the Baker shot. In an August 7th memo, he wrote that it was, quote, imperative that nothing interfere with our concentration of effort on the atomic weapons stockpile, which constitutes an important element in our present national defense. Around the writing of that memo, Los Alamos only had 7 atomic bombs. But we were now in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and opinions were divided as to what we should do to prepare ourselves. Dr. Warren and Admiral Blandy shared the opinion that the only defense against an atomic bomb lies outside the scope of science. It is the prevention of atomic war. However, the president agreed with Groves's position that we needed to maintain as large a stockpile of nuclear weapons as possible, so the Charlie shot was canceled. This would be one of the last decisions Groves would make concerning the atomic project because the Atomic Energy Commission was created in 1946 and officially took over all activities that had before fallen under the Manhattan Project, as I said last episode. Groves was transferred to other duties related to atomic warfare for the Army and Navy. At the same time, General Electric took over administration of the Hanford Project in Washington, and in 1947, they expanded operations to include 5 new plutonium production reactors, 2 new chemical reprocessing plants, and 81 of the underground waste storage tanks that we alluded to last episode.
Oh, wow.
All of the plutonium created for the post Manhattan Project weapons was produced in Hanford. The addition of all of these new reactors and plants meant they were working even harder than they had during wartime, and so more water was pulled from the Columbia River to cool them. The water ran back into the river with higher temperatures and higher levels of radioactivity than before as well. To keep up with Hanford's demands for uranium, more facilities were built elsewhere in the United States, like the Farnold Feed Materials Production Center 20 miles outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, a uranium isotope separation plant in Paducah, Kentucky, the National Reactor Testing Station between Idaho Falls and Arco, Idaho, a nuclear weapons assembly plant near Amarillo, Texas, and plutonium production plants on the Savannah River near Aiken, South Carolina.
They were not kidding around.
No. I mean, we're naming pretty much all the states at this point.
Yeah, that's why I like they pretty much said like, all right, everybody,
Yeah.
suit up. It's time to take your jobs.
Yeah,
Like,
all hands on deck.
yeah, all hands on deck. All right, Paducah, you're separating the isotopes. You got that? Okay, great. Arnold, you are going to mill the uranium. Like, what the fuck? Like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in the Pacific, the Navy began searching for a more suitable location for the Bikinians in 1947. Despite the fact that Operation Crossroads ended the year before, and the Bikinians wanted to return home. They were told it would
Yeah.
be a few months.
Yeah, like, can we go back to our flattened home now that's full of radiation? Thanks.
Yeah. They found a bigger atoll in the Marshall Islands called Ujalong Atoll, but the Atomic Energy Commission stopped them before the move could start. The AEC wanted another location to do tests, one that would support an airstrip. So they were going to take over the Eniwetok Atoll in the northwestern part of the Marshall Islands and force the 120 people who lived there to move to the Ujalong Atoll instead. And they were told they would be able to return to their home in 3 to 5 years.
Okay, couple things here. First, where are the Marshall Islands?
So the Marshall Islands are, I believe, part of Micronesia, or they're right next door to Micronesia. So they are way out in the Pacific, kind of to the northeast of Papua New Guinea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then these atolls are kind of in the same area,
Yeah.
essentially,
So the atolls are like the little coral reef circles that make up
in
the
the
Marshall
Marshall
Islands.
Islands. Okay,
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
it. They're just different. They're just named different atolls. Got it.
Yeah. And they're
Got
all
it. Got
like
it. Got it.
hundreds of miles away from each other. And so they're like loosely grouped as the Marshall Islands.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Ujalong was smaller than Eniwetok by 4 times, and the lagoon was 1/15th of the size. The Eniwetok people were moved more abruptly than the Bikini people and lacked building material for their new homes and canoes, which made their transition all the more difficult. The people of Bikini couldn't move to Ujalong, and so they were instead moved to Kwajalein, which was one of the biggest atolls in the Pacific, but was also a major Navy base. And so the Bikini people were originally put on the big island there, but then they were located to a smaller island to make room for people on the base. They just keep getting moved around.
Ugh, this is terrible. I mean, and like they're given the patient. I mean, at least they were. That's what I was going to say earlier. At least these people were told it was
Mm-hmm.
going to be years. But also think about what testing
Mm-hmm.
over 3 to 5 years is going to do to your home.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
Like it's
if it can
not.
make it 3 to 5 years,
Yeah.
right?
There's just a lot of lies being told to these people.
Right. And then they're getting hop, skip, jumped around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But so they were only on this smaller island near the base for 2 months, and then they were moved again to the Kili Island in the southern Marshall Islands, which had no lagoon and could not be depended on for seafood the same way the atolls could. Like they're used to, I
Mm.
guess, what is a very specific kind of fishing, and now they're being asked to do a completely different kind of fishing.
Like, oh, do you want to relearn your entire culture and way of life?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Bye.
In addition, Kili was 1/6 the size of Bikini in terms of dry land, and the seas are so rough for 3 months out of the year that ships can't sail in and out.
Ugh.
And
So
then,
they're basically like stranded.
basically, yeah. And then the coral reefs around the island were originally so thick that they were too thick for any ships to like even approach very well to begin with. So the US actually had to demo a section of the coral reefs just so that they could like sail in and out more easily. And despite all the promises and the hardships for the Bikini people, as of 2021, there are now 451 people living on this tiny ass island, and none of them have been able to return to their ancestral homeland of Bikini Atoll.
So it wasn't 3 to 5 years after all.
Well, 3 to 5 years was what they told the Eniwetok people, but Bikini was told a couple of months.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and regardless,
Yeah.
decades later, half a
Decades later.
century later.
Yeah, and now they're living on this
Like,
like small island. Their population is like 4 times the size that it was. It's ridiculous. The Eniwetok tests began in April 1948 as Operation Sandstone and consisted of 3 tests done in secret, whereas there had been over 100 media representatives present to report on the 2 bombs dropped on Bikini. Like they were very proud of those tests, but these ones gonna keep it on the down low. And the reason for this secrecy is that these bombs were second gen atomic weapons intended to be more powerful than the Fat Man or the Little Boy. They contained both uranium and plutonium, and they could be produced quickly and assembly line style.
Do we need something stronger?
I don't
Why
personally feel
why
that
did
we
we need
do,
why did we need something stronger? I
because
don't
we were starting to get information that enemies were starting to produce their own atomic weapons, and so we
Mm.
needed to have bigger atomic weapons.
Mm.
So, X ray was the first sandstone detonation, which was using a second gen weapon 50% more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb, and at that point was the most powerful explosion ever recorded in history. It took 3 days for the radioactivity to decrease enough for researchers to enter the area. And the next test, Yoke, was detonated in May and was even more powerful than that. For security purposes, all physical evidence related to the results of these tests was destroyed, so I don't really know much more than that.
Like as like particulars, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, as you were asking, why are we doing this? In 1949, the Soviet Union conducted their first test of an atomic bomb, meaning that we knew that they were doing research to get to this point ahead of
Well, and
time.
they're
Yeah.
making progress.
Radioactivity was detected by US forces in the air and traced back to Kazakhstan, and was also detected in rain collected in Alaska. The US decided then that the next step must be taken to develop an even stronger bomb. The means had been known in the scientific community for some time. This bomb would not only use plutonium and uranium, like the two on Anahuac, but
Mhm.
also tritium and deuterium gas, which are heavy isotopes of hydrogen. Because if you remember, deuterium is the isotope of hydrogen that is present in heavy water.
Mhm.
So, this means they were using hydrogen fusion, and hydrogen fusion speeds up fission reactions and was anticipated to more than double the release of energy in such a weapon upon detonation.
We
Yeah,
okay.
this is where it starts to get like really terrifying to me. Like, as I was doing my
Yeah.
research, I was like, I think I am done for the night. This is too much for me to handle.
Yeah,
S-
because that's ridiculous. Like nothing needs to be that big,
No, no,
that devastating.
yeah. So, we were making a bigger bomb with fewer resources. Plutonium was easier to make than fissile uranium, but still difficult, and uranium stores were running low. However, with the threat of the Soviet Union looming large again, mining which had ceased in 1945 in the old vanadium and uranium mines located in the Four Corners region started up again. The Navajo leaders, which had permitted the mining on their reservation, were unhappy with the original agreement, as they had seen no additional money beyond the $130 a day that each individual person got for their work. In 1949, new terms were set with the tribe so that the tribe would only grant operating permits to its own people, and the government would be the only customer. The Navajo people exclusively would get to work in the mines, so they'd be making all that money, and the
Mhm.
government would be the one to set up ore buying stations, so they don't have to deal with all that. They would also be the ones to set up exploratory drills, so there's no cost to the Navajo people for that, and they would set the prices for ore. So this
What a
limit,
deal.
I mean, it at the time it did seem like a deal, and they were still,
Right.
of course, getting screwed because people aren't being upfront with them and they're not getting as much money as they should. It's
Right.
yeah. So this, limitation on who could be in the mines, it limited the expertise and manpower. So the government requested that the tribe sublet the uranium claims. The tribe could collect the fees as the landowners, but the ore would get out of the ground faster. But what that means later on down the line is that the tribes would be left with all the cleanup afterwards of people digging in their ground.
Mm.
So, this guy, Ralph Beatty, he worked for the Manhattan Project in Grand Junction, Colorado from 1942 to 1945, salvaging uranium from the vanadium waste that we kind of talked about briefly last time. When the mines were opened up again in the region, Beatty began working for the AEC's Colorado Raw Materials Office in 1948, and Colorado Raw Materials was basically just a euphemism for uranium.
Mm.
And he immediately became concerned about working conditions in the mines. Beatty knew that there were safety standards for radon, and so he took samples from Colorado mines to ensure that the mines in the region were safe. And the samples showed that they were absolutely not safe. They were ridiculously high. But the AEC put up a year-long battle with the New York office of the Manhattan Project over who was responsible for these mines and getting the radon out. Because the AEC had studied the effects of beryllium, which was used in the manufacturing of bombs like the one that poisoned Louis Slotin, and so they knew that they were responsible for establishing and maintaining safe occupational environments, 30-minute exposure rates, daily and monthly exposure rates. And so those are all like toxicological rates that can be looked at is like how much are you exposed to in 30 minutes? Beyond that,
Mm.
how much are you exposed to in a day? How much are you exposed to in a month? And
Mhm.
so they were responsible for maintaining safe exposure rates like on all three levels for beryllium. Exposure in excess of these amounts determined by the AEC, like bit of a conflict of interest here to be determining like what is safe when you have to regulate that. But they were monitoring it and they knew that if you were exposed to beryllium above those levels, it could result in a lung disease known as chronic beryllium disease or berylliosis.
Mm.
And they'd already had miners and they'd already had people working at Los Alamos that had died from
From this
berylliosis.
disease, okay.
So they knew like what it meant to have like occupational safety standards and they did not want to get into that with radon. But as I said in the last episode, there were known values that were dangerous for overall radiation exposure, and that's what doctors Nolan and Warren at Los Alamos didn't know about during the Trinity test.
Mhm.
But there were no known exposures for radon specifically. Occupational exposure to any radioactive material in particular had not been seriously discussed outside of the military since the Radium Girls case in the 1920s. However, radon was a known decay product from radium, which is a known decay product of uranium, and that's why Beatty was interested in it. What radon is a radioactive gas that is the second cause of lung cancer worldwide and is the leading cause of lung cancer among non smokers.
Hmm.
Radon 222 in particular has a half life of 3.8 days and is the most stable isotope of radon. It has an immediate decay product of radium 226, and it also has radon progenies. So you have like your parent and your daughter, like decay products. They aren't really referred to as like parent daughter anymore. I guess it's misogynistic to say that radiation is like women. I don't know. But so you have these
But for the
progenies.
example, it makes sense. I'm following.
I'm fine with it. I don't
I'm fine
know.
with it. We're toxic. It's great.
But so the radon progenies are the main source of human exposure to alpha radiation, which we talked about last
Mhm.
time. If you breathe it in, it's going to cause damage, and this is a gas, so like that's the main way you're going to
Main
get
way
it into
is
you.
yeah.
And so that's what causes the cellular injury and the DNA damage, and it causes damage to the respiratory epithelium that eventually causes lung disease, including lung cancer.
Mm.
In March of 1949, Beatty finally got information to the Colorado Health Department, but even they were slow to act. It wasn't until details of preliminary tests were leaked to the Denver Post that July that anyone took action. The article described a chemist mixing uranium with his bare hands and workers eating lunch in radioactive sections of a Vanadium Corporation of America mill, and also had the quote.
Ralph V. Beatty confirmed the findings of the state officials. Definite radiation hazards exist in all plants now operating.
Yeah, not
Mm.
not looking good if you want to keep your
In
job.
all. Yeah, in all of them.
Yeah. But the action taken was by the AEC and the VCA, who berated Beatty, of course, for saying anything to anyone about radon. He was placed back behind a desk in Grand Junction to avoid going into mills or bringing anyone with him to do any more testing of radon.
Hmm.
But now the word was out. A public health service sanitary engineer visited 3 mines on the Navajo Reservation in November 1949 and found dangerously high levels of radon in all 3. But the one in Cane Valley was 10 times higher than the recommended limit established by the New York office.
Uh,
2 months later, the U.S. Bureau of Mines took more readings that corroborated what the PHS had found, with levels 4 to 750 times higher than the recommended limit. They were astronomically high amounts.
Yeah, that's insane.
But the worst part is, none of the miners were informed that there might be any risk to them, despite these readings. Instead, VCA, who ran the mines on the Navajo land, offered to ever so generously perform free health screenings on the workers, including blood and urine analysis and x rays. The miners were told that they would be informed if anything of concern was found during the screenings, but the PHS wanted to keep everything under wraps, especially with the Cold War still ramping up. There could be nothing that interfered with the mining of uranium or the building of the next bomb. Back to the Pacific Proving Grounds. The Marshall Islands were considered too far away for the next set of tests needed now that the Soviets had proven they had their own nuclear weapons and more US testing was being called for. The islands in the Pacific were expensive to get to and subject to espionage, and so testing was moved to the continental US. AEC Chairman David E. Lilienthal warned about the policy and psychological considerations involved with the radioactive fallout on American populated areas. So they kind of knew what the repercussions could be. A location had to be chosen that was secret and far from civilians which could be impacted. The Korean War began in June of 1950 and increased pressure on U.S. military to maintain their nuclear supremacy. So, a site at Frenchman Flat in southern Nevada was selected for continental tests, while Eniwetak would continue to be used for larger blasts not permissible on U.S. soil. The Nevada Proving Grounds were established in 1950 on part of Nellis Air Force Base, which was only a co-leasee on the land, and that created some difficulty. The site only had 4,100 people downwind from a 125-mile radius of its center, including one rancher in Las Cruces, New Mexico, who owned two-thirds of the proposed test area and grazed 40 horses and 250 cattle on the land.
Oh no.
An expert panel concluded that there was, quote, not a probability that anyone will be killed or even hurt, but the probability that people will receive perhaps a little more radiation than medical authorities say is absolutely safe was possible. And Enrico Fermi suggested that the inhabitants be told to stay indoors and take showers.
Because that's going to fix it all. Take a
Then,
nice shower.
but there were more complications than just that. The 1863 Treaty of Ruby Valley defined Western Shoshone land, and in the treaty, the Shoshone agreed to let settlers travel across their land, and the U.S. government would pay for that access. But the tribe didn't cede the land to the government, it was their land. The testing was conducted in secret, even from the tribe on their land, and this was obviously a direct violation of this treaty. People were living on Western Shoshone, Washoe, and Paiute reservations within the range of testing fallout, and they were not given the same consideration that other residents were, which was not even the warning that Enrico Fermi suggested. But on the day that test program Operation Ranger was given the go ahead on January 11th, 1951, handbills were distributed that informed residents work would be done in the area for the atomic weapons program, but that no public announcement or announcement of the time of any test would be made. They were ensured, however, that there would be no danger to health or safety. And specifically, they were told that tests would only be conducted when the wind was southwesterly to avoid the high population dense towns in California, and there, quote, couldn't possibly be any damage to the Colorado River from fallout, and that the people of Las Vegas would be shielded from the effects of the tests by the mountain range between them. Members of the native tribes, meanwhile, only learned about the programs when these events were relayed in the newspaper, and they were only able to believe that they too were not in any danger. This is also how the Navajo mining the uranium in the Four Corners region learned about the possible dangers of uranium. But at a meeting with tribal leaders, the Office of Indian Affairs, and the AEC, they were simply told that the PHS was currently looking into that matter, and then they quickly changed the subject.
Because of course they did.
Testing at the Nevada Proving Grounds began on January 27, 1951, with the detonation of the 10th nuclear weapon worldwide under the code name Operation Ranger Able. Explosions from the Nevada Proving Grounds could be seen from Las Vegas, Nevada, and St. George, Utah. Children would sometimes be removed from classrooms to watch the blasts, and people reportedly began setting their alarm clocks to be up and watching during the typical detonation times. The ash would be all over the cities nearby, and by nearby I mean they were within 200 miles of the detonation.
Yeah, that's not exactly like nearby. Like,
Yeah, and the ash settled so thickly that children could write their names in the dust. Now, when Trinity was detonated in 1945, there was a group of 12 girls at a summer camp only 50 miles from Ground Zero. They saw the light from the explosion and felt the blast, and then the warm ash snowed down on them, which they were permitted by the camp counselor to play in. The counselor and her stepdaughter both died from cancer. Only 2 of the 12 girls at the camp lived beyond age 30, and the last one living in 2020 was Barbara Kent, whose hair went white shortly after her exposure as a child, and who suffered from endometrial cancer and skin cancer and had to have her gallbladder removed. So, there are a few heroes in this story, and one of them, to a small degree, is Utah Governor Scott Matheson, who lived in Cedar City during the tests and believed in the patriotism symbolized by the nearby testing as he was growing up. But as governor, he became concerned about the increasing cancer deaths in southern Utah, and so he helped to get Pentagon documents declassified that indicated the government only did the testing when the fallout blew in the direction of the lowest population. That meant that it was blowing towards St. George, Utah,
ugh.
and the government knew at this point that there was a risk.
Yeah, they can't play dumb at this point.
Not
They
at this
know
point.
better. Yeah, they
Yeah.
know better.
The first sign was that sheep started to die. Their skin started to slough off, and they had burns and bleeding lips. They were also developing mutations. Livestock near the Trinity test site had the same sorts of injuries, and the ranchers suspected that it was the testing. They weren't able to sell the contaminated cows and tried to sue the government in October of 1945. However, the government, true to form, blamed poor range conditions for the sheep, like it was the ranchers' fault. Geiger counter readings confirmed what the ranchers suspected. As far as the ranchers near the Trinity test site, the government did eventually pay the market value of the cows and then sent them to Oak Ridge and Los Alamos for radiation testing. And so by the time the sheep started to die in Utah, they knew what they were doing and they knew that they were at fault, but none of those ranchers received any sort of compensation at the time. The AEC said that it couldn't have possibly been fallout that caused the death of 4,000 animals, and this was by 1953 that they were arguing. The ranchers sued the federal government, but they lost their case in 1956.
Ugh, that's terrible.
In May 1951, the basic concepts for hydrogen bombs were detonated on Eniwetak under the code name Greenhouse George. This explosion used heavy hydrogen deuterium surrounded by uranium and a plutonium rod in the center to spark the detonation and create fusion energy rather than fission. When it exploded, it became the next largest explosion in history to that date, releasing the equivalent energy of 225,000 tons of TNT. On November 1st, 1952, the first actual hydrogen bomb was dropped, codenamed Ivy Mike. Upon detonation, the fireball from the thermonuclear blast could be seen 30 miles away, and within seconds, the diameter of the column of smoke in the mushroom cloud spread to 3 miles wide. At 6 minutes out, the mushroom rose 100,000 feet into the air and spread 100 miles in diameter. The intense size of this blast meant that it took longer to dissipate than previous fallout clouds, and the wind scattered the particles in all directions. Again, we had outdone ourselves by creating the largest blast in history. This time, it was 10.4 megatons, more than 700 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
Holy shit.
This is where I started to get terrified, honestly. The Alugalab atoll upon which Ivy Mike had been detonated completely vanished, and in its place there is now only a crater 1 mile in diameter and 164 feet deep. Seismic readings at the UC Berkeley campus picked up on the shockwave from the blast 20 minutes after detonation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That same year, the Public Health Service and Colorado Health Department published a report on the health of workers in uranium mines and mills, which found that Colorado mines had absolutely insane levels of radon gas, higher even than that in the German mountains where death from radon was first realized. They were ignored, and the Surgeon General in Washington stated the blatantly false claim that many of the measures suggested in Colorado were already in place in the industry. Installing ventilation systems in these mines would have only cost between 50 cents and $1 per ton of ore, which VCA was making between $9 to $11 of profit on. And this is equivalent in 2023 to being asked to pay $6 to $12 for something you make $104 to $127 of profit on
Right.
in exchange for people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, it's honestly, like, despicable.
Well, things are about to get more despicable back in the Pacific.
Oh, because of course they
Yeah,
are.
of course they are. So, despite having evacuated the Marshall Islanders from their relocated atolls for past tests, and also despite the results of Ivy Mike, the US government decided not to relocate them for the detonation of another H bomb codenamed Bravo on Bikini Atoll. They rationalized this decision by saying they were not in direct danger from the explosion, and it was not in their jurisdiction to move them when fallout might be the only concern, upon vegetation and wildlife in particular, but they also felt confident that no one would be exposed to fallout downwind, based on results from Ivy Mike, as I said. But this is a batshit thing to say because the wind from Ivy Mike carried the fallout in all directions because it was in the sky for so long. So
Mm.
that was just a baffling thing for them to be like, the wind's gonna carry it. It's gonna be fine.
Right.
So at 6:45 a.m. on March 1st, 1954, the Bravo H bomb was detonated on Bikini Atoll and exploded with double its anticipated force. It released energy the equivalent of 15 million tons of TNT and was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fireball which erupted had a recorded temperature of 100 million degrees Fahrenheit, and the blast vaporized 3 million tons of sand, coral, and water, leaving a crater a mile in diameter on the ocean floor below. A mushroom cloud erupted larger than any seen before, rose higher than any clouds before it, and carried the radioactive fallout to parts unknown. Later studies revealed that if this bomb were dropped in Washington, D.C., victims in the Washington Baltimore area up into Philadelphia would be exposed to enough radiation to induce acute illness and death within 10 days. People in New York City would experience the same kinds of acute illness, and 60 to 95% of people exposed would die within 30 days, and people as far north as Quebec would experience radiation sickness within just a few hours, to include vomiting, diarrhea, and fatigue that would also experience white blood cell count that can lead to bleeding and resistance to infection. At 1 p.m. on March 1st, over 7 hours after the detonation, radioactive ash began to fall like snow onto Rongelap Atoll. It stuck to the skin of individuals standing outside, causing itching like mosquito bites, and also got into their eyes. It turned to mud on the sweat of their skin and got into every crevice between their limbs. The ash turned the ocean a sickly yellow color, and fish collected from the ocean that day tasted bitter, as did the fish which was set out to dry in the open that day when the ash fell. The radioactive blizzard over the island lasted for over 10 hours, during which time the 82 islanders suffered more intense itching and burning skin, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Rongelap Atoll was in its dry season and was rationing water such that everyone had their own barrel attached to the roof of their house to collect pure rainwater for their families to drink. When the black rain began to fall, it was funneled into these barrels as well as the communal water supply. Once the military realized Rongelap had been exposed and they finally tested the area, it was 5 p.m. on March 2nd. The radiation was high enough that just 10 hours on the island in those conditions was enough to affect blood cells. Residents had been exposed for so long that the concern of acute reactions was severe. Evacuation was delayed because so many of the Navy had been exposed to the blast and their ships were either too radioactive to be used or the men aboard were too sick to perform the evacuation themselves, having been exposed to heat from the blast or having received beta burns. And so the people on Rongelap remained on the contaminated island until 10 a.m. on March 3rd. They had to leave behind most of their belongings, but also all of their food animals, the community's 2 dogs, and all of their goods for trading. Although they'd been exposed to high levels of radiation for nearly 40 hours, their complaints of nausea and lack of appetite were blamed, in part, on the strange food they were fed while on board a ship that could have also induced seasickness, and none of them were considered acutely ill. Either the government was downplaying the symptoms out of insensitivity, or they were avoiding saying anything that could be leaked. Already, they had decided that under no circumstances should any details about Bravo's detonation be leaked to the public. Another nearby atoll where 18 Rongelap people were living temporarily was also evacuated, as were the 154 people on Utaric Atoll to the east of Rongelap, which was further from Bravo and experienced somewhat less fallout. Medical care was given to all exposed, even if the physicians did not think they were suffering from acute conditions, but it was all secondary to the real concern of the government, which was to collect as much data from these unintentional human test subjects as possible. For 3 decades following Bravo, the exposed American servicemen and Marshallese were part of Project 4.1, study of response of human beings exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from high-yield detonations, all without being informed that they were part of any study.
Yeah.
They were not told much at all. They knew some about the tests because that could hardly be avoided on the Marshall Islands, but they didn't know about radiation. They didn't know what the ash was. They didn't know how they were sick, and they didn't know what the various drugs the naval officers were giving them were or what they were for. Within 10 days of exposure, the people from Rongelap Atoll began exhibiting beta burns, where deeply sunburnt parts of the skin began to peel away, leaving depigmented skin and sometimes becoming infected. The burns itched, and on the scalp they caused the hair to fall out. Many of the islanders were barefoot when the ash fell, and the resulting burns on their feet made it painful to walk. But these burns are a sign that something deeper is happening in the body, including a significant drop in white blood cells. A majority of the children had beta burns, and the most significant drop in white blood cells was seen, of course, among the children. Their white blood cell levels continued to drop over the next 2 weeks, but it wasn't until March 16th that any analysis was done to examine possible isotopes present in their systems. Urine analyses performed at that time showed high levels of radioactive strontium 90, which is taken up into bone and causes damage to marrow and red blood cells. However, no one was showing any signs of bleeding or infection, and so blood transfusions and antibiotics were not considered. Instead, it was taken as another opportunity to examine the human body's response to exposure, despite the fact that strontium 90 had been considered since 1949 to be by far the most hazardous isotope resulting from nuclear detonations.
So they already knew how strong that one was.
Yeah, and they just want to treat these people like guinea pigs because they
Yeah,
can.
well, and they're like, yeah, literally, they're like, well, we have all of these subjects. It would be a waste if we didn't, do science on them.
And I just can't help but see the really terrible irony in that, since, like, that's one of the things that we condemn the Nazis for most strongly.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And yet, despite all of this unintended exposure and all of the horrible results they'd gathered from the detonation of Bravo, the Navy was not done with thermonuclear tests. Another round began on March 27th on Bikini Atoll, and 4 more followed. The people of the Marshall Islands were not the only group being used as guinea pigs without their consent. The turnover rate for miners in the Four Corners region was too high for the Public Health Service to get enough longitudinal data to determine the results of human exposure to radon. The AEC was more than happy to help them get data, since they were always interested in getting information on human exposure to radiation. In particular, a researcher from the University of Rochester wanted to get involved because he'd already had experience injecting terminally ill hospital patients with uranium and plutonium without their consent, and was impressed with how the PHS, quote, seemed to have conducted their work so far without unduly alarming miners as to hidden hazards that may exist or in any way impeding mining operations. So, the real crime is capitalism all along.
I mean, that's always the answer. It's literally always
Yeah.
the answer.
The AEC got the PHS directly into the mines to examine 1,319 miners. Only 181 of them had visited voluntarily for any reason the year prior. On April 20th, a committee of the Marshall Islands Congress filed a petition with the UN to protest the Pacific Proving Grounds tests and to demand compensation for the islanders exposed to fallout. The petition described how they were not informed to not drink the water on their island, and how complete recovery could not be promised to any of them with their lowering white blood cell counts. They were also worried that they would never be able to return to their homes and demanded compensation for that loss as well. Rongelap Atoll was again tested for radioactivity soon after the petition was filed, and it was determined that the island would need to remain uninhabited for at least another year. The 154 Utarik people, plus 3 babies born off the island, were returned to their atoll on June 4th and were given $1,200 total for their loss of trading wages during their time away, which is the equivalent of about $13,700 today.
Wow.
The Rongelap people were again moved to Egypt Island and were given a total of $1,000 a month for provisions, and an extra $240 every 3 months to make up for the money they would have made trading. But there were few food resources on the island to supplement their diets, and relatives who had left the island for work or school before the detonation were now forced to join them on Egypt and spread the funds even thinner. They were constantly running out of money before the end of each month and being forced to borrow money from the AEC. 2.5 years after they'd been relocated, the Rongelap people and their unexposed family members, who now numbered 400 total, were returned to their home atoll, which had been reconstructed to their specifications. The unexposed population was now considered a control population for the research conducted on inhabitants, and all of them were regularly flown to Chicago for radioactivity measurements over their entire bodies. At this point, I believe they were still only being told that they were getting medical care the United States owed to them, but no one was told about the danger of radiation and their food supply on the atoll. Except for coconut crabs, which I guess were the most contaminated, and they were told not to eat those. But they were also like, why shouldn't we eat the coconut crabs? And they were still not being told that they were part of a human study.
Well, not only they're not being told they're part of human study, they're not being told how incredibly dangerous the living conditions that they're in
Mhm.
are.
Mhm.
I mean, they're in the dark and
Mhm.
and they're just like, why am I sick?
Exactly. Well, and like most of them don't feel super sick yet either. And so they're like,
No
we
big
like
deal. No
yeah,
big
we
deal.
we like the medical care because our white blood cell count is low and that's a bad thing, but like what if you just left us alone? You know? But some of them were like kind of getting smart to like I think we're being treated as guinea pigs. I think that there's like ulterior motives here.
Mm.
So in 1959, the Rongelap people questioned why they needed to be flown back to Chicago and examined again. They felt healthy in general and felt that they didn't need any more treatment. Some of the children who had been less than 6 years old were experiencing growth delays, but there was nothing really specific that they felt was wrong with them. But as you said, they didn't know that the radionuclide body burdens had increased because of the contamination on the island where they'd been living and eating, and their white blood cell counts still never returned to normal. That same year, the studies conducted by the Public Health Service of uranium miners hit their 5-year anniversary with unsettling results. 91 people had died since the study began, 9 of which were at least suspected to be from lung cancer. For the miners who were on the records before the AEC intervened and had been watched since 1942, 25% of deaths among them were from lung cancer, and this was roughly 3 times greater than the numbers expected. And lung cancer wasn't the only risk. There were also documented cases of 10 other cancers, including that of the pancreas, colon, and liver. Non-malignant lung diseases like silicosis, fibrosis, and tuberculosis were also on the rise among uranium miners. These numbers were met with action on the part of the AEC and the PHS, but as one worker from the Division of Radiological Health would later write,
When large numbers of uranium miners die of lung cancer, PHS will be asked what it did about the problem, and the answer will have to be, not much. We did too little too late. The only conclusion an objective observer can reach is that someone has abdicated his responsibility. We can plead lack of money or lack of authority, but the fact remains that aggressive leadership could have accomplished more than has been done.
the Cold War reached its hottest point during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the Soviet Union installed nuclear weapons in Cuba. The US had amassed approximately 30,000 nuclear warheads by this point, while the USSR had what they considered to be a pitiful 6,000. After the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the USSR increased production, and within a few years, the global stockpile across all countries was over 65,000. In 1965, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara summarized deterrence of nuclear aggression by saying, "It means the certainty of suicide to the aggressor, not merely to his military forces, but to his society as a whole." The Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed by the US, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain in 1963, banning all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, or underwater, but notably not underground. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by 190 countries in 1968, which intended to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology and to reach a common goal of nuclear disarmament. Even before these treaties were signed, the uranium mines of the United States were experiencing a slowing of demand. In 1960, the Colorado PHS stopped their large scale examinations of miners, and by 1966, only 25 people were working the mine in Cane Valley, Arizona, which at its height employed over 100. And yet, it was only the following year that Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Labor, realized that there was an issue in the mines and that his department had control over them. A trust fund was established in 1963 for the 82 exposed people of Rongelap, which totaled $1 million. Stuart Udall, former Arizona congressman and Secretary of the Interior in JFK's cabinet, was placed in charge of controlling the fund so that the people of Rongelap would each get their fair share. Although the people decided they would rather get a payout totaling $950,000 immediately than have their money in some American fund, and I can't blame them for that.
Yeah.
The distribution of this money in 1965, though, came with the agreement that the claims against the U.S. for the injuries caused by the Bravo detonation would be settled.
Hmm.
Authorities still maintain that the health issues for the Rongelap people were not terrible because there was no evidence of leukemia or radiation poisoning.
Yeah.
Never mind the fact that bone development in many of the exposed children was restrained. There were notable increases in miscarriage and stillbirths, and children were developing nodules on their thyroids. This last presentation was the most significant, as it was considered the first undeniable long term effect of radiation, and some of them were found to be cancerous.
Hmm.
On June 10th, 1967, a regulation declared that no uranium miner could legally be exposed to radon levels which would put them at a higher risk for cancer than a non miner. With the collapsing of the industry, though, no one informed the miners of this legal right, and they did not inform them of the rationale behind it. After the mines were emptied of ore and workers alike, tailings were piled up and left in the open. In 1959, academics had been concerned about the access the general public had to these tailings, especially children who might be prone to play on the sandy hills they created. But nothing was done. So the nearby Navajo residents who were familiar with this resource and unaware of the danger decided to make use of it. They used the tailings for free cement in the floors and walls of their houses, schools, and churches, and to stake their fences on their properties. The yellow dirt was sprinkled into the soil of garden roses and tomatoes. In 1966, the Colorado Public Health Department became aware of these practices in Grand Junction and asked the local PHS for funding to investigate just how bad the radon problem was in these structures and neighborhoods as a result. But the AEC intervened and denied the funding. They argued that the radiation detected was natural and attempted to disprove the preliminary findings in Grand Junction by conducting tests in Tennessee and Florida, which were known to have high natural levels. But their own findings confirmed what the PHS had discovered, so they suppressed them under for internal use only classification.
Hmm.
Luckily, Colorado representatives went to Congress and also got the attention of Glenn Seaborg, who agreed that the government had a moral obligation to remove the contaminated material. Tailings were removed from 4,000 private and commercial properties in Grand Junction. But now Congress was aware of the larger problem of the tailings, plenty of which were still out in the open and blowing alpha, beta, and gamma ray emitting particles in the wind. The tailings also contained heavy metals like thorium, lead, and polonium, which Colorado DHS worried were contaminating the watershed. Unfortunately, it would be another 9 years before anyone realized that the same practices of using tailings as a free resource for building materials was also being practiced by the Navajo people in Cane Valley, Arizona. By this time, the EPA had been established, and it was actually one of their reps who noticed the radiation problem in Arizona, but the higher ups at the agency refused to do anything about it.
Was that just because, like, the nuclear program outweighs the importance of the EPA?
I have no idea what the reasoning
Like,
was on this. Like, it really should have been that the EPA did something. It was their guy who
right.
found it and was like, "Oh, hey, this is definitely our jurisdiction." But I don't know why the EPA chose not to step in. Like, there was really no reason for them to have
Right.
been like, "This isn't our problem."
Okay.
Cancer deaths among the Navajo people doubled from the early 1970s to the late 1990s. And this was especially significant because prior to this, the Navajo people seemed to be somewhat immune to cancer in a very interesting genetic sort of way. But I mean, after working in the uranium mines, that totally reversed.
Mm.
The PHS was continuing to keep tabs on the miners, and two scientists told the New York Times in 1978, "What we refused to do 30 years ago, we are paying for today. What we refuse to do today, we will pay for in 30 years." In 1972, the first death from leukemia on Rongelap claimed the life of 19-year-old Lakosh, who had been only a year old when Bravo struck and was the youngest person exposed to the fallout. Further legislation was written for the people of Rongelap in 1977 to compensate them for the thyroidectomies many of them had to have, and $100,000 was paid to each family who lost someone from a death resulting from the blast. Dr. Joseph L. Lyon at the University of Utah in 1979 published a study on cancer in downwinder communities in the United States, which found that the higher exposure the radionuclides, the higher the rates of leukemia and thyroid cancer. The effects were greater when exposed as a child, and exposed children were 2.5 times more likely to develop leukemia after exposure, and all but one of the 32 children from the fallout zone who died from leukemia had lived in the area all their lives. In New Mexico, there was a strange outbreak of neuropathy among Navajo children living near abandoned uranium mines. They suffered from liver damage, dimmed vision, and painfully curled fingers and toes that they could not uncurl. The average life expectancy for the afflicted children was only 10 years of age.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I mean, by the 70s and the 80s, it is not looking good. A congressional hearing occurred in Salt Lake City in 1979, wherein the government was accused of covering up the effects of radioactive fallout on downwind communities during testing at the Nevada test site in the 50s and 60s. Representatives could now not avoid the reality of leukemia and cancer rates and livestock deaths and use this hearing to focus on prevention of future disasters and compensations of victims and their families. But still, these hearings only focused on the downwinders of the Nevada test site. In 1981, the University of New Mexico met with medical researchers from around the country to discuss some startling findings from the Four Corners area. Rates of miscarriage in that area specifically were increasing, as were birth defects. Reproductive, breast, and bone cancers among Navajo teenagers were 17 times higher than expected, and there was not yet a statistically significant pattern for brain tumors, but it was also not looking good. And notably, these findings were all centered around the uranium belt of New Mexico and Utah. The following year, studies were conducted by a fresh doctor at the Indian Health Service Clinic in Shiprock, New Mexico, to pinpoint the cause of the sudden increase in stomach cancers in the community. When drinking water sources nearby were measured for radiation, they found levels as high as 139 picocuries per liter in wells and 4,024 picocuries per liter in lakes. In 2000, the drinking water limit would be set at 30
Oh my
picocuries per liter.
god.
Yeah. People and livestock alike had been surviving on these water sources. The St. George Ranchers case was heard again in 1982 after a 26-year delay, this time with documentation proving that their sheep had high doses of radiation in their thyroids. The same judge who previously sided with the government in 1956 now conceded that the fallout was, in fact, a factor in these deaths. But then the verdict was overturned on appeal, and the appeal was sustained by the Supreme Court in January of 1986. Stuart Udall, coming back, he's another one of the heroes of this story. He agreed to take on the case for the downwinders who were documenting increased cases of cancer beginning in 1978. Allen versus the U.S. government in 1984 was a landmark ruling of these defendants. Irene Allen's name was used alphabetically, but it represented 11,092 plaintiffs. 24 cases were tried as bellwether cases, and the downwinders won, but a court of appeals reversed the verdict, saying that it was at the discretion of the U.S. government to perform the tests for the sake of national defense. Essentially, the government couldn't be sued for policy questions against them. Because this is all just policy stuff, right? We're just
Yeah.
talking policy.
We're just talking about policy. Like, lives are not involved in any way, shape, or form. People are not actually suffering.
Right.
Immensely. Yeah. No big deal.
But they kept fighting, and Udall also took on many of the Navajo miners in his court battles.
Okay.
And so, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, in 1990, which covered downwinders living or working near the Nevada test site between 1947 and 1961, as well as uranium miners in the Four Corners region. Beneficiaries included the U.S. Army soldiers in foxholes as well, because when they were doing the tests at the Nevada test site, they had structures built. Any of the video that you may have seen of like windows being blown out, cars being blown out, and like all of those really intense explosions that you've seen that are like, the duck and cover videos and whatever, that's from the Nevada test site testing.
Okay.
And they had foxholes dug that they put Army soldiers in for whatever reason, so that they could be used to the tests or so that they could see like how close they could get the foxholes to the tests. So a lot of Army servicemen were exposed in these foxholes.
In addition to, wow.
Yeah. So it included them in RECA. RECA provided $50,000 to individuals with disease, $75,000 was given to workers, $100,000 was given to uranium miners, and as of April 2018, $2 billion in claims had been paid.
Good.
In the act, Congress also apologized on behalf of the nation for genocide and radiation exposure, which, let's not sugarcoat it. That's what it was.
Yeah, that's what it was, yeah.
But they do not admit to lying about the risks. So, I don't know. if you're gonna say, like, "Yeah, we committed genocide," why don't you just say, like, "We also lied?" Like, just put it all out there.
I mean, right, yeah, we fucked up, but we didn't lie about it.
Yeah. Like,
We didn't
obviously you
do
did, though.
that. Yeah. Like,
So, RICA was supposed to expire in 2022, but it was extended by Congress, and so now it's set to end in May of 2024. And, like, obviously this is decades and decades after, and a lot of people maybe have died and can't get compensation, but if they need it, they can get it until May of 2024. Unfortunately, RICA has not been extended to the populations affected by the Trinity blast. And these
hmm.
people identify themselves as the Tularosa Basin Downwinders, and they are still actively fighting to be included in RICA, which, again, ends next year. So I don't know if they'll ever see compensation if they're not
Right.
ended or if RICA is not again extended. Nuclear testing in Nevada didn't end until 1992, and in total, 928 above and below ground tests were conducted at the Nevada test site by that point.
Holy shit.
hmm The people of Rongelap attempted to return to their ancestral atoll in 1985, but unfortunately, their return was short lived because of the continued contamination of the vegetation and fauna. In 1986, the U.S. came to an agreement with the Marshall Islands that recognized their self governance, as well as that of Micronesia. Additionally, a $150 million trust fund was set up that would be distributed to the people by the Marshallese government. The Diné Natural Resources Protection Act banned further uranium mining in Navajo country in 2005. While the tribe did make money for the mining on their land, they were left with the issue of cleanup and contamination, and they realized somewhat early on that they never made as much money as they were promised. The government currently is seeking to store nuclear waste on western Shoshone land under Yucca Mountain, aka what was once the Nevada test site, but is still the tribe's land. When the demand for plutonium slowed down in the late 60s, the first reactors at Hanford were shut down. However, plutonium production did not completely cease until 1987, and up to that point, Hanford continued to add waste to the underground tanks. This final shutdown was motivated by the release of a 1986 report from the DOE that described how the waste created by the site and leached into the surrounding environment was actually far worse than what people had originally thought. The Department of Energy, which took over ownership of Hanford, signed the Tri-Party Cleanup Agreement with the EPA and the state of Washington in 1989. Cleanup was originally expected to take 30 years, but by 2019, the situation had worsened. In 1998, an advisory panel for the DOE reported that as many as 68 of the 177 underground storage tanks had begun leaking chemical and radioactive waste. Further leaks were reported in 2005. Then, in 2013, Washington Governor Jay Inslee was informed that 6 more tanks were leaking waste at a rate of approximately 150 to 300 gallons per year.
Holy shit.
Despite the DOE's insistence that these leaks did not pose any health risks, they were aware of a 2012 report which found toxins in the air at Hanford that exceeded occupational levels and which causatively produced lung and brain damage in workers. The DOE themselves performed 20 studies in nearly as many years that confirmed safety risks to their workers. In 2016 alone, 61 workers at Hanford were exposed to carcinogenic substances on the job, and nuclear experts interviewed by NBC called Hanford the most toxic place in America and an underground Chernobyl waiting to happen. Which is kind of interesting because that 1986 investigation was actually prompted following Chernobyl when everybody was like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe we should check out what's going on with all of our nuclear shit.
Right. Like, oh, maybe this is a good time for a little peek under the hood.
Yeah. Exposure in the Hanford workers has brought on respiratory and cognitive symptoms, including shaking, nerve damage and pain, memory loss, and unusually aggressive cases of dementia in young people. The Hanford Challenge Watchdog Group believes that a 2011 death of a worker with dementia was directly work-related. Even with 9,000 workers on the job who have already removed more than 7.5 million gallons of waste and treated 18 billion gallons of contaminated groundwater, cleanup of Hanford is now expected to end in 2093. Best case scenario, all of the liquid waste in the leaking tanks will be sequestered into stronger holding tanks no earlier than 2062. Although that process was supposed to start this year, and I don't think that's actually happened, so that's probably being pushed out further into the 2060s, which doesn't even sound like a decade.
Wow.
The still functioning parts of Hanford became the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in 1995 and currently has a staff of approximately 5,700. Oak Ridge National Laboratory is also still running and also has a similarly sized staff. Los Alamos National Laboratory is currently running with a staff of 12,700 and takes on around 1,600 students for research every year. It is the largest employer in northern New Mexico. An untold number of people have suffered as a direct result of nuclear testing and atomic war. But even now, so many decades out, we are not in a safe place with the state of nuclear warheads. As of the recording of this episode in October 2023, Russia has announced its intent to withdraw from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And all I can think now, with everything we've learned up to this point, are the possible words of Jewish-German physicist Albert Einstein, whose work with relativity led in part to the creation of nuclear weapons.
I don't know what weapons might be used in World War III, but there isn't any doubt what weapons will be used in World War IV. Stone spears. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Bina Steineko. Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.